Welcome to another Thursday evening or afternoon, if it's where you're at, to science, m- philosophy, and what's the last word?
Metaphysics.
Metaphysics Thursday. Amen. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Pandit?
Oh, I'm fine. Ready to go.
Ready to go. Excellent. I'm really excited to hear about tonight's topic. So, those viewers who are viewing us right now, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to put those questions in the chat. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Pandit.
Okay. Hello and welcome again. Some of you have been following us for a few weeks. And if you have joined us for the first time today, well, it's never too late. You can always go back to the previous recordings and get up to speed. However, we will do a short review right now so that we can get ourselves oriented and all come together and be on the same page. So we will start with our slides right now. Here we go. Today's topic is about the post death scene. Last time we wondered what would happen. How will we explain Christianity? And we said we'd look at that. But now a short review. Our first question that we had asked was a prime reality question. And if you asked that, it was, what is that thing from which everything else comes? And if you keep asking the question, you come to the big question, which is God's existence. And we found the claim of God's existence is based on science, philosophy, and common sense. In other words, that conclusion is a rational conclusion. Number two, we looked at evolution because evolution seemed to say we don't need God at all. Natural selection can do it. But when we looked carefully at the theory itself, evolution is not a scientific theory. It's not backed by actual data. And so we had to put it aside and still hold on to the idea that God certainly exists. And then three, we asked whether all the religions were the same. We looked at the writings and we found they are not. Every religion claims to be the only way. So when there are three or four claiming to be the only way, we looked at it logically and we found that logically, if that's the case, only one of them is actually telling the truth when it says, I am the only way. So if that's the case, we should make sure that we are on that way. And so we were going to try to identify that way by comparing the five great world religions: Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity. So the first thing we did was we compared their literature, and this is what we found. The New Testament is the best attested ancient historical piece of literature in the world. I mean, compared not just to the religious literature, but to all literature. And we compared it to some of the top notch historical documents. And we found that the historicity, the features of historicity of the New Testament are way above compared to any other writing. Then we also asked whether the writings and the message could have come from a divine source. And we checked that out using Laplace's scientific determinism, which says that if there's an intellect, he would know both the past as well as the future. In other words, he will be able to predict. So we looked at the test and we called it predictive prophecy. Does this writing have prophecies, predictions that really came to pass? Because if they came to pass, and many of them did come to pass, well, then the source of this material could have been that intellect. And that intellect had to be omniscient. In other words, Laplace's determinism showed that the intellect had to know everything about everything. And only then can that mind actually make a prediction that is correct and consistently do it. So the scriptures we found, the writings, when compared all of them, the Bible is historical And it is the only writing that actually describes a test to check whether it's material and the message is actually from a divine source. It's the only one. No other writing ever tried even to do that. So it was quite impressive. Then we turn to the founders and we asked, what is the highest claim you make for yourself, Mr. Founder? And we found that Jesus made the highest claim of all. He claimed to be God. And then further, not only did he say he was God, every other founder brought a message to the world. Jesus said he was the message. In other words, every other founder had to get a message from a superior source, from a supernatural source, and then pass the message on to the human race. Jesus was the source of his own message. That's why he kept on saying, I am. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am life itself. I am the light of the world. The words I am showed that he had a claim that no other founder could match at any given time. He was himself the message, and that's why he said, I am the message. Then we looked at the life of the founder, and we asked, did your life match your own teachings? So, what was the yardstick? Your own teachings. And again, we looked at them, and every other founder slipped or fell or just utterly went against his teachings except for Jesus. The only founder whose life matched his teachings because he had practiced his theory to perfection. In other words, he's the only one who lived an unblemished life, unblemished to the point of perfection. So those studies all showed us being pushed, nudged towards Christianity. And I said, if everything looks to be in one direction, then is there bias pushing us in that direction? And so we asked a question, are there other studies in which Jesus does not come out first? He doesn't come out on top. And we looked at that. So when we studied those, we found three in which he does not come out first. And if he does not come out first, then he comes out last. These are the three that we looked at, in which he came out last. Birth stories. He was born in the most poverty stricken condition, where animals are born. And worse, he was conceived out of wedlock. The people called him the B word. In fact, there's a genealogy of the Jews in which they come to father and then son, and then that father comes to the son, and then to his son. When they come to Jesus, they don't even mention his name. They just say so and so, bastard son of an adulteress. That's his start of life. And then we asked, how long was your ministry? Gautam Buddha had 45, Moses 40 years, the Hindu masters generations. Muhammad 23 years, Jesus 3.5 years. That's it. Shortest. Why so short? Because he was hated by his own community and booted out and sentenced to death. So that is the worst picture that we found. And finally, the death. Every founder died an honorable death. People were around there. The followers were close by. And when they died, oh, there was so much of mourning because a great leader had gone. In the condition of Jesus, crucified, stark naked, humiliated, all alone. And from his lips came the cry, I am forsaken of God. So he was condemned by the highest religious authority, by the highest civil authority, Rome, and in the Jewish mind, the highest authority in the universe, God himself. Because the Torah, the writings of the Jews, said that if anybody is hanged, he is cursed of God. So there he was hanged, cursed of God. So these three pulled him down to the lowest part of human worth. I mean, he was finished, he was gone. So, when a person reaches that level, how do we explain the continuing of the movement? How do we explain that it even prospered? It should have gone in the next few days, not even gone to the next generation. But yet, this picture does not actually explain what happened to the world, in the world. This picture cannot explain the origin and rise of the greatest ethical and moral enterprise in history, the Christian church. Do you know it's the largest enterprise, spiritual, moral, ethical? More than 2 billion people swear to Christianity. How can we explain that with a criminal who was dead? So we are forced to look beyond the death and burial of Jesus. So the question that we are asking today, what happened after death? So we call it the post death scene. So here are the scenes from all these different religions. In Hinduism, cremation, everyone mourn the loss, and then take the ashes and throw it into the river Ganga or Ganges, signifying a merger with the eternal. And then they would make memorials and shrines, and other scholars would take over, take what they had taught, and then add and expand on it. And that's how the Hindu thought developed over centuries. In Buddhism, when he died, once again, great mourning. And many people wanted some part of his remains. And so what they did, they worshipped those relics and then divided into 8 parts, because 8 kings wanted them, and they gave each of those relics to each of the kings, and they took them back with a sacred sense of awe and take it to their towns and to their cities, and they created stupas or memorial mounds for the relics. That was the story of what happened after death in Gautama Buddha's narration. After he died, other monks took over the monasteries. And today there's a string of monasteries in many places of the earth. When it comes to Islam, Muhammad died, but Abu Bakr, the next leader, took it over seamlessly because he was already known to be the next in command. So Muhammad dies, everyone is mournful, weep over his death, and then Abu Bakr takes over, and then Umar, and then Uthman, and finally Ali. These 4 are known as the caliphates, the caliphs. And that period is known as the caliphate, and it's also called the golden years because one died and the other took over, and that was the story. It seems to be the same story all over. Here again, in Judaism, after the death of Moses, Moses had already pointed out who would take over. It was Joshua. So after the death of Moses, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua. So the leadership passed on to Joshua. So in every case, the leader and the founder dies and the leadership passes on. Except here, there's no passing on. He says, I'm with you, even to the end of the age. Yes, I was dead, but I am alive. And I am alive forevermore. I have the keys of Hades, of grave, and of death. Suddenly we come to an absolute opposite. What is that story? It's called the resurrection. Now, the meaning of the resurrection is philosophical and religious. But whether or not it took place is not philosophical or religious, it's historical. Here are some words by Professor Pannenberg. Whether the resurrection of Jesus took place or not is a historical question. And so the question has to be decided on the level of historical argument. For most Christians, it is not a historical argument, it's a religious question and is decided by religious persuasion. If you're a Christian, then you'll say he rose up. Not because there's any evidence, but because you're a Christian. That's a religious reason for saying that he rose up from the dead. We are asking, did it happen? Not whether you're a Christian. Did it happen? Here we come to the sharp focus of the first principle we mentioned. You see, we can't compare the doctrines of these religions. We can compare their stories. The stories is from where we got the doctrine. So if the story is okay, the doctrine is okay. If the story is not fine, the doctrine cannot be fine. So here's a question. In the story, did it really take place? If this story is credible, then it's believable. So here's the question for today. Can the story of the resurrection of Jesus be established to any reasonable degree as a real, physical, historical event? Or is it only a fabricated myth that the Christians blindly believe? Have you ever asked that question? Honestly asked the question? Or do you keep on saying he rose up from the dead without even checking it out? If you have not checked it out, then you're a blind believer. If you have checked it out, we can do something about it. Let's take a break for a moment. All right. Our question is, did it happen? But there's an even more basic question. Why not simply dismiss it without any scrutiny? It appears mythological. Person rising up from the dead, of course it's mythological. The story. But we're asking it because we can't simply dismiss it. Two reasons. Number one, it is written in the best attested piece of historical literature of the ancient world. It is not legendary or mythological. If it was legendary or mythological, I think everyone would have just picked it up and thrown it in the dust can, just in the trash can. It's not worth anything. But it is written in the best attested historical piece of literature. So we can't just dismiss it. We have to give a good historical reason also to dismiss it. And when you look at it, here's what Philip Schaff said: it is either the greatest miracle or the greatest delusion which history records. Did you ever think of that? Because if it is wrong, it's a horrible delusion, a hoax. So we have to decide. Now, the question here is, do we have sufficient information to decide whether it could be a historical event? Here are the words of Wilbur Smith on that. Let it be simply said that we know more about the details of the hours immediately before the actual death of Jesus than we know about the death of any other one man in all the ancient world. We know more about the burial of the Lord Jesus than we know the burial of any single character in all of ancient history. Wow! There were kings and emperors and military generals who reigned and died. We know more about this person's, the details of his death and burial, than we know about the death and burial of anyone else. So we might have a way of checking this out. We will check the story and see whether there's any evidence that they are trying to pull a fast one on us and just throw out a kind of a red herring and just fool us. Let's check it out. But when you check it out, here's Aristotle's dictum: the benefit of doubt should be given to the document that you're analyzing, not to the arrogated by the critic to himself. Why? Because the critic was not present, whereas the writer in this case was an eyewitness. And secondly, in a court of law, you are innocent until proved guilty. So this is what John Warwick Montgomery said: one must listen to the claims of the document under analysis and not assume fraud or error unless and until the author disqualifies himself by contradictions or known factual inaccuracies. So that's what we will do now. Because if the story is said to be unbelievable, which it is, the story by itself is unbelievable. Why? Because it strains our rational thinking. Person rose up from the dead. Whoa. But if you don't believe it, what could the correct story be? Something happened. So if you want to correct it, it should fit in with the rest of the story. It should not strain our sense of reasoning. This is what David Hume, the philosopher, said. You can believe a miracle, but only if disproving the miracle by an explanation, and that explanation is even more unlikely than the miracle, then you believe the miracle. Or if you're making an alternate story, that alternate story is also a miracle, then you might as well stay with the first miracle. So the alternatives proposed, remember Rusht, Abul Walid Muhammad Rusht, he said you should cite your opponents as well. In other words, we have to identify opposing story, those who say it never happened. If never happened, then something else happened. So here are the two basic theories they say. He did not die. He only fainted. Blood loss, blood pressure came down. He fainted. People thought he was dead, put him in the tomb. But then he rose up from the tomb. The second one is he did not rise. He actually died, but the body was stolen. So both these theories are trying to explain the empty tomb, because the empty tomb is not controverted by any scholar. There was an empty tomb. The question is, how did it get empty? He did not die. So we're going to look at these two theories. 5 ways in which we're going to look at this claim: he did not die, he only fainted. It's called the swoon theory. We're looking at what Pilate first of all said. See, here's the story. Jesus was crucified. 8 hours later, people came to Pilate and said, we want his body because we want to bury that body in an honorable way, not like this, crucified. That's not the way he's supposed to dispose of his body. No, we wanted the body, please. And the writing says Pilate marveled that he was already dead. Why did Pilate marvel? Because crucifixion takes days to kill. You don't die in hours. Average time to death is 2 to 3 days. And here in 8 hours, you're saying he died? So, in other words, Pilate had reason to marvel. In other words, the writer who is writing this out has a ring of truth in his narrative, because he knows that Pilate would marvel. And in his writings, he has written he's marveled. So, what did he do? He didn't hand over the body. He said, no, I've got to check this out. A person doesn't die in 8 hours. So, summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So, when he found out from the centurion, then he gave the body. So, who was making sure that he died? Pilate. How did he make sure? He asked the centurion. How did the centurion know he was dead? When they came to Jesus and saw he was motionless, already dead is in quotes, they did not break his leg like they usually do to hasten death. But how to bring his body down? Because Pilate says we need to give the body to these people who are asking for it. But what if he's alive? Well, he's motionless, looks dead. How do you make sure that he's dead? Get a soldier with his spear, one thrust. That is why they thrust the body of Jesus. People who are on the cross are not thrust through with spears. No, this case it was. Why? Because they wanted to make sure that the body was dead. And that is why. So who's making sure? Pilate, centurion as well. And then John writes in his book, he says, he was thrust with a spear and blood and water came out. So physiologically now, blood and water? Well, there is something known as the broken heart syndrome. And it's a real syndrome that has been diagnosed after post-mortem. They find people who are under tremendous strain and grief and loss suddenly die. And when they do a post-mortem, they make this diagnosis. Suddenly the heart just stopped. Sudden acute heart failure. That's one. The other is acute rupture of the heart muscle. The heart muscle tore. In both these instances, there would be a collection of blood around, and a collection of blood would be red. But for that collection of blood to separate into a clear portion and a red portion, it would take some time for the red blood cells and the other cells to slowly settle down. So here we see a possibility that the spear would have hit at the junction of these two places, the red portion where the cells are all settling down, and the top portion, which is called the serum, which is clear. And if that's the case, then we could have two streams coming, but there are two conditions that have to be met for this. Number one, the blood must stop flowing. Flowing blood does not separate into cells and serum, and it must stop for some time. Exactly the word that Pilate asked the centurion. Is he dead for some time? So, water and blood coming out of the wound would have suggested he was already dead for some time. Number four, how did he get out of the tomb? Okay, he only fainted, placed in the tomb, and how did he get out? How did he unwrap the grave clothes? Because in those days they wrapped them around and they wrapped them with their arms stiff like this. So, how did he undo the wrapping? How did he find the doorway in the darkness? How did he break the seal which was on the other side of the door? How did he roll away the stone? It's called golel in Aramaic. The word golel means large stone. And when you read descriptions of that, at least three people are required to move a golel. Here, Jesus was wounded. He was not one person, he was about half a person. How could he have moved that golel? And the golel, which is the tombstone, it was not lubricated. Nobody lubricated those stones in those days. So, how did they move that without any grinding sound? Nobody saw the movement silently. And did all the guard look the other way exactly for the period in which the disciples came and rolled away the stone? And then Jesus really came out by himself, wounded, his feet were pierced, his back was beaten up, his torso was thrust through with a spear, and he, can you imagine him even trying to run? And these strong, athletic soldiers standing over there, just let him go. Again, we realize that these explanations are also like a miracle. How about the next one? Who thought that he was dead? When multiple people from different angles say he is dead, why should we, after 2000 years, say that he really was not dead? Pilate was convinced. He got it from the centurion. The centurion was convinced that he was dead. He made sure he thrust him with a spear. The friends of Jesus also were convinced Jesus was dead. How do we know? Because they brought embalming material. Now, if you look at the embalming material, it has to be toxic to the proteins. In other words, when you put embalming material on proteins, they denature them. So you never embalm a body that is alive. You only embalm a body that is dead, because if you embalm a body that is alive, you will cause death. So the friends of Jesus also thought he was dead. That is why they brought a bunch. In fact, they said in the record 100 pounds of embalming material. So if you bring that much, you are convinced that he's dead. So today we have no reasonable grounds to dispute the point. We may safely deduce that Jesus was really and truly dead. Let's take a break. All right, let's get to the next one, the theft theory. The body was stolen. Let's go over 5 points again, one by one. Here's the report. His disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. There's an inconsistency in that report because one cannot be awake and asleep at the same time. If you were asleep, how do you know it was the disciples who stole? You could have woken up to see the body gone, but you can't say the disciples. So the moment you say it is the disciples, that means you were an eyewitness, you saw the disciples. Well, then how did you let them steal? So, both ways it's inconsistent to say that you were asleep, and while asleep, you know that the disciples stole. It is also externally, it is also externally inconsistent because if you watched them stealing, why did you let them steal? You were the guards, they were not armed, you were armed. How did you let them steal? So, internally, externally inconsistent to say that theft had taken place. Number two, the story says that people looked into the tomb later on. Peter looked and saw the cloths all there, and there was a handkerchief which was folded together. Now, that folded piece of cloth is a question. When a person wants to go and steal, theft, you're a robber, you're a thief. You don't fold clothes. You don't go and take what you want and say, wait a minute, before we go, let's fold clothes. So the folded cloth is not a description of a place that has been ransacked by a thief who wanted to steal. Folding clothes? Question. Taking out a naked body, this is something that is really too strong for me, especially who comes from the East. What is the explanation for unwrapping the body? Suppose you and I wanted to steal the body. Hey, the body is nicely wrapped in the perfect condition for you to just pick up and run. Why are you sitting there unwrapping with the soldiers just a few feet away? What is the explanation? None. There is no explanation at all for why they would sit and unwrap the body. Okay, they wanted to steal the body and say he was alive, then why not take the whole with the clothes? Why naked? Secondly, the reason why people crucified these criminals stark naked was to take away all the last vestige of dignity, just shame them. So, are we saying that the disciples unwrapped the body of Jesus and shamed that lifeless body? It is not possible, my friends. When you say that these disciples were purposefully causing shame to a dead body and that body is their own beloved master. No, this is a good reason to just disregard the whole story. Nobody in the East will ever even hint of exposing the nakedness of his rabbi or of his guru. That's a psychological hurdle I don't think anyone can cross. So this story that the disciples stole is again suspect. And just like Jesus coming out of the tomb, how did the disciples get in? There's no practical method of how the disciples got in to steal the body. They just said he stole. Tombstone, sealed, guarded by armed soldiers. How did they get in? No explanation. So if you don't give an explanation, you are asking for a miracle. Number 5, if you say they were thieves, then you are accusing them of being criminals. When you want to establish a crime, the motive is an absolutely important part of the whole process of establishing crime. In other words, it's very difficult to establish crime unless you give a motive. Here, they had no motive to steal. They were scared. They ran from him. How would they have picked up the courage to go and steal his body? They didn't know he was going to rise up. They didn't know that they were going to tell that he rose up. In fact, when the disciples heard the story from some witnesses that he had risen, they refused to believe. In fact, they could not believe it. So we cannot pin a motive when they themselves didn't believe it. So the theft theory, based on these 5 conditions and factors, does not stand up to scrutiny. So, what have we gone so far? Non miraculous explanations of what happened at the tomb have to face a cruel choice. Either they have to rewrite the evidence to suit themselves, or they have to accept the fact that they are not consistent with present evidence. Now, I notice on the chat there is a question: would the Bible be acceptable in our search? No, we are not accepting what the Bible says, we are questioning it. In fact, we are asking, is there evidence? Any internal evidence for that? So, what we are doing is not simply swallowing. We are reading the story. Yes, it's written in that book. So we are taking the story from the book, but we are not blindly swallowing it. What we are saying is, you are saying it happened. Really, show us the evidence. So what we are looking at is a person who's saying, no, it didn't happen. This is what happened. One, two, three, and we are just looking at that one. But we are not swallowing the story, we are checking it out. And in this instance, we are checking out the story from the other side. In other words, the claim that his body was stolen. So that's what we are doing. So non miraculous explanations of what happened at the empty tomb have to face a choice. Either they have to rewrite the evidence to suit their own story, or they have to accept the fact that if they made another story, it is not consistent with evidence that we have in the best attested historical piece of literature in the world. So, if you look carefully now, this is what's happening. Each theory, the theft theory and the swoon theory, they contradict each other. The swoon theory said Jesus did not die. The theft theory said he died. The swoon theory said he came out by himself. The theft theory says, no, he didn't come out by himself. His body was stolen. So if you look again carefully, these two theories are so positioned that if either is true, each would destroy the other. And at the same time, each is asking for miracles. There's no difference, my friend, between saying Jesus rose up from the dead as a resurrection from saying he came out of the tomb by himself with no explanation at all. And you look at the way he was put inside there, the tombstone, the soldiers, his coming out from there, if you want to say that he came out by himself, is no different from a miraculous event. But these two theories were proposed to do what? To discard the miraculous event, and yet each of them sits on a miraculous event. So neither of them dismisses the miraculous. So we go back to David Hume's criterion that a miracle may be believed only if we find that the alternative is much believable, much more believable, if the alternative makes good sense. If it does not, then we might as well stay with the original one. So disproving the miracle, if that also requires miracles, then we haven't done anything. We have only jumped from the frying pan into the fire. We have not run away from miraculous. In fact, there's not a single other theory that can really remove the miraculous. So, if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, we've looked at two pretty carefully. So both the swoon theory and the theft theory would have required multiple miracles compared to the resurrection. So both are miracles. All three are miracles. So if you don't like miracles, then you can't have those theories, the swoon theory or the theft theory. You need to actually discard those because they require multiple miracles. So if the resurrection story is true, and that's our question now, do we have some evidence available to weigh out and evaluate? Really? We do have some evidence. 4, the change in the disciples, the fact that there is a Christian church. And number 3, those who wrote the story claimed to be eyewitnesses. And number 4, they held on to their story at the point of death. So these four are what we will go through one by one. We will do them in 2 weeks hence, because next week I will not be available, I will not be here. So we will look at these four. So what have we done so far, my friends? We have looked at the claim. Yes, there is a claim. The only claim of the founder, that he rose up from the dead. And when you look at that, oh my goodness, he actually predicted it himself. That's amazing. And while it's amazing that he predicted it, it can be really amazing and acceptable only if it happened. And so the question was, how do we know it happened? Did you blindly swallow it, or did you check it out? Look at the number of questions that we asked just because it's a difficult report to believe. It's an unbelievable report. That is something that everyone should know, whether you're Christian or non Christian. It is an unbelievable report. And therefore, if it is to be believed, it has to be established. You can't just simply swallow. And that is what most of Christendom has done, simply swallowed it. And so when they are challenged, you have nothing to say. If a person says, no, he didn't die, by the way, there are people who clearly say he didn't die. In fact, there's a whole religion on that. Islam says Jesus never died. In fact, they gave a good reason. It's a part of the reason that we ourselves looked at. Jesus was the most perfect, the most blameless, the most innocent. And the Islamic tradition says it is impossible that Allah would allow this kind of a person to die. And so when they came to the cross, Allah switched him with somebody else and took him straight to heaven. So here we have another big statement saying that Jesus never died. How are you going to answer that? So simply swallowing it doesn't work, my friends. We got to look at it carefully. And just like Abul Walid Muhammad bin Rushd said, you must look at the opposing points as well. That is what we did today. We looked at the opposing points. What do you say if you say he never rose up? Okay, he fainted or his body was stolen. We found that those really don't work. Why? Because we checked it out. We didn't just dismiss it because we are Christians. We checked it out. And when we checked it out, it does not stand scrutiny. That is why we put it to one side. And now we're looking to see whether there is some positive evidence. We will see that 2 weeks hence. So now the Q&A session for today.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're clear.
All right. So if there are anyone on any of the platforms that we're streaming today, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll go ahead and put those questions on the screen for you. I thought it was very, very fascinating, especially when you were giving the different scenarios with Jesus either was in the tomb. You know, you gave the scenario with the Roman soldier. If he was just the multiple witnesses, and actually you made me think for a little bit, just from the aspects of, okay, Jesus, how big was that stone? And I started looking that up, and it's like, okay, that stone, and some of the writers, they said that stone weighed about 4,000 pounds or 2 tons.
Yes.
That's insane, especially for the disciples to move that away. And then you got to think about, okay, the Roman soldiers that were guarding this tomb. How many? Where in history do you have soldiers guarding a tomb because of what this man had said? And not only what he had said, but the Pilate had given the leaders, the religious leaders of that time frame period, jurisdiction over these Roman soldiers. It's mind-boggling. I mean,
It really is. It's not just the disciples who must roll away the stone. Remember, the swoon theory is that Jesus has to roll away the stone if
yeah,
he came out by himself. And Jesus is not one man, he's half a man. He's been wounded severely. So he can't use his hands to rule away, move a 2-ton stone. He can't use his feet. He might have used his shoulders, but if he has to use his shoulder to push it, he has to push against his feet. He can't do that either because his feet also are pierced. What could Jesus have done with that stone? Nothing. He could have actually, when you look at the way Jesus, they do burials, they wrap them up and place them on a stone slab. The most Jesus could have done at that point was to just feebly whisper, nothing else. And so, if in that condition you say he walked out, it is no different than a miracle. That's what we're trying to say. If you make an alternative story, please make it believable. Otherwise, the story that eyewitnesses have said can be at least viable, at least a good possibility. So, the story, the picture we're trying to paint is that any other story is also miraculous. Like you said, the disciples, how did they get inside? How did they move that stone? What explanation can we give? And the fact, of course, their theory was that the disciples stole. If the disciples stole, you were standing there, God, why did you let them steal? And how do you know it's the disciples? Were you awake? And if you were awake, why do you let them steal? So, again, when you go look at it very carefully, many people, many people jump all uh,
oof,
this wrestling with the question and simply swallow. That's on one side, the believing side. On the other side, there's no wrestling at all. They just dismiss it as mythological. So, what have we gained by either swallowing it or throwing it out? We have not gained an intellectual position. An intellectual position requires that we look at whether the story is historically valid.
right. Yeah, and all good points, all good, valid points. Even even from the aspects, and you had mentioned the disciples. Um, for one, you're right. You have a wounded man. Not only was he in the tomb, wounded on the hands, has this flesh wound on the side, the feet, but then you have these trained soldiers outside of the. It would be like breaking into a small Fort Knox just to get
Right.
this the body of this man. The disciples, fishermen.
Yes. So that would be a miracle. So you are still claiming a miracle, hoping to throw off another miracle. That is what we are saying is not rational. If you want to throw off a miracle because it's a miracle, then please make a statement and a description which is not miraculous. But every other one is also miraculous. I see one question on the chat. Where did the theft theory originate? The theft theory originates with the soldiers, and the theory is in the writing. In the writings, it says that the soldiers came to Jerusalem, and the priests actually they came, according to the story. Actually, they came to say that he rose up because they were witnesses. If there was any witness on earth who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, it was those soldiers.
Yeah.
They were amazed. So they came to Jerusalem saying, "Hey, he has risen." The chief priest said, "No, here's what we want you to do. Say that the disciples came and stole, and here's a whole bunch of money for you." Why? Because a soldier who is asleep at his duty is usually sentenced to death. So, why are they going to say that the disciples stole while we were there? The only way that they agreed, according to the story, is that the priests gave them a whole lot of money. That's the story. Gave them a whole lot of money, and now tell the people that his disciples came and stole. And again, just because they told that story doesn't mean it passes muster. The story itself is internally and externally inconsistent.
I love the question that's being posted.
I didn't hear you.
Are you there?
Yeah,
All right, there's a
yeah.
question that's being posted right now, and it's an interesting question. It says, could it be that Jesus? Oh, wait a minute. It moved on me. Sorry about that. There it is. What would cause all of them, all the soldiers, basically, to fall asleep at the same time?
Again, you will ask for a miracle.
Miracle.
It has to be a miraculous event that all of them slept at the same time. They had drugs in those days, just like we have, but not sleeping pills. So you had to go and give them a huge dose of sleeping medicine, and each of them agree to take it. Look, we are asking for a miracle. That's the main point we're trying to say.
The other
Could it,
question.
could it be? It says, did you
Yep.
see that? Could it be that Jesus was taken up just like Moses' dead body was taken up? When you say, could it be? Of course it could be. You know, when sometimes when I'm out there in the secular setting, when there's a mixed audience, sometimes suddenly there's an atheist who stands up and says, Doc, is it not possible that actually there is no God? Isn't that possible? I say, of course it's possible. And you can hear the gasp from the believers because they brought me there to fight for God, and here I'm saying it's possible that there is no God. But I say, wait a minute, I haven't finished my sentence. In a court of law, it's always tell the truth, but the whole truth, not just the truth, because just speaking the truth may be a lie. You have to say the truth and the whole truth. So here's my whole response. Yes, it is possible that there is no God in the universe. And then I look at the atheist who asked me, and I say, the other part is that there is a possibility that he is in existence. Are you going to agree to that? And that's why, wait a minute. Let's stick to one side. No, you have to go to both. So even here, could it be that Jesus was taken up just like Moses? Of course. That's what the Muslims say. He was taken up. Allah took him to heaven. He didn't die at all. So, of course, it could have been. So, that is one part. It is possible. It's also possible that he died and was resurrected. So, now we have two theories. If you look carefully at metaphysical topics, there is no such thing as proof. There is only what is called weight of evidence. And the concept of weight of evidence itself implies that there is evidence on both sides of the theory. And so, whenever there's a question like this, we say, yes, it's possible, and that's theory number one. Theory number one, it is possible that God took him straight to heaven, he didn't die. But theory number two still remains. He died and rose up. So now we have two theories. Let's look at all the evidences we have and see where the weight of evidence goes. And you will find that the weight of evidence to say that God took him up is not there. There is no evidence at all. It's a theory, and you can propose the theory, and it's fair enough. You can propose the theory, but it does not knock off this theory because we still have to go to 2 weeks hence. What is the evidence for the resurrection? If that's the case, then death and resurrection took place. It is not that he went straight to heaven. It's possible, but there's solid evidence on this side. Hardly any evidence except the claim that he went to heaven without dying. So, two theories, anytime. We don't have to, in other words, just prove them wrong. Accept it as a theory, place it on the table, take another theory, place that also on the table, and look at both the theories and look for the weight of evidence. And you always find that the weight of evidence will tilt towards one side. There is no situation that I have found in which the weight of evidence is so clearly, knife edge right in the middle that you can't make out. No, everything that we face, look at it carefully, you will find that it has a weight of evidence that goes to one side or the other. It's called evidence, weight of evidence. Once you find that, like in a court of law, by the way, in a court of law, also there's no proof. What they do is weight of evidence. When the weight of evidence reaches a certain level, then the judge says, okay, we got it. In civil cases, it's called preponderance of evidence or clear and convincing evidence. Once it is there, the judge decides. In criminal cases, the level is higher, beyond reasonable doubt. It is still only weight of evidence, not proof. Beyond reasonable doubt, then the judge says, this is my decision. So, what we are doing is weight of evidence. Are these theories, do they have the weight, or is this theory that has the weight? And as we go through carefully, you will find the weight tilting, because ultimately there is truth out there, my friends. There is truth. We can find it.
Thank
Any
you.
other?
I was having problems with my mute button. Any other questions? I see one question that just came up in the chat. It says, is there, in fact, I'll put it up on the screen. It says, is there any other historical documentation besides the Bible that can serve as evidence of, and I believe, the resurrection they were talking about?
Is there any other historical documentation besides the Bible that can serve as evidence of a resurrection? All right. I will respond in more, at least in two ways. Number one, have you asked this question about Alexander the Great? Whether Alexander the Great is written about in historical writings other than Greek history, so that you can say he was alive. If you didn't do that for Alexander the Great, if you didn't do that for Julius Caesar, if you didn't do that for any of the others, why are you asking it for it here? The reason we are doing that is because there has been two levels of documentation or evidence that we want. And when you do that, then you are playing double game. No. Treat it like any other historical piece of literature. You don't ask whether somebody else is writing about it. We never do that. When you look at, for example, there is something known as the Black Obelisk. It's a limestone stele on which there are some writings and some pictograms. And when you look at what it is, you can make out that this is Shalmaneser, a king who had defeated other kings, and they were all bowing at his feet. That is the picture and the writing. Not a single historian ever challenges that. No. Why? Because it's written. And unless you can show that it is wrong, we don't ask whether there's somebody else who says Shalmaneser actually did that victory. Did he actually accomplish that victory? No. Once it is written in a historical piece of literature, we accept it. That is why our first question was, is the New Testament a historical piece of literature? And we found that it is the best historical piece of literature in the world. So that was my first response. Why are you asking? As a historian, you should look at it and look for corroborative evidence right there. And we are doing it right now. Number two, there is indirect evidence from other sources to say that something very unusual happened here. And once you say unusual, you can't just use the word unusual and leave it. You have to decide what is that unusual thing. Extra biblically, there have been people. There was a person who wrote to his son, and this is extra biblical documentation, which says, what advantage did the Greeks get in killing Pythagoras? What arguments did this nation get in poisoning Socrates. What advantage did the Jews get in doing what they did? So, in Jewish writing, we find that there's a question. In Roman writing, we find, for example, Pliny the Younger, he's supposed to be one of the officials, he said he has seen Christians who were worshiping Jesus as God, as a person was resurrected from the dead. So this is not Bible. This is Roman writings. And what we saw was the earliest writing of the Christians. If you remember, it was by Professor Eliezer Sukenik. It was on pots of ossuaries, receptacles in which you put dead men's bones. And on that is written Jesus, God, Jesus ascended one. Those are the exact words on that. This is not the Bible. This is on a pot, on a burial receptacle. Jesus ascended one. In other words, the story had already gone around, and the people believed in the story because they were eyewitnesses. In fact, some of them were eyewitnesses of seeing Jesus after he rose up from the dead. So, offhand, I can't mention the exact locations, but there is enough evidence outside the Bible to say something absolutely unusual happened. And if you say unusual, then you have to describe what that unusual thing is. And the only unusual thing that we can look to is the resurrection of Jesus. There's no other story that can explain this question of being so unusual. It's kind of earth shaking, kind of like an earthquake. If there's an earthquake, we know something big has happened down in the earth. Similarly, here, the Christian church, we will see that 2 weeks hence. When you look at some of the evidences, not only in the Bible, but outside the Bible, we have to agree that something absolutely unusual happened. You have to explain it. So, why are they describing the swoon theory and the theft theory? They're extra biblical, right? Outside the Bible. Why are they proposing it? Because something happened that needs to be explained. And what is that something? An empty tomb. The empty tomb is not just biblical. The empty tomb is even agreed to by those others. And that's why they're trying to explain the empty tomb by the swoon theory and by the theft theory. So it's not just biblically that he rose up. The people knew something drastic, absolutely amazing had happened.
Thank you, thank you. Actually, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to that, and Michelle, yes, she wants to thank you for answering her two questions there. Um,
Welcome.
I know we're at the top of the hour, and we are about to close here. One of the things that let me do this. One of the things that always comes to my mind is just some of the supernatural stuff that is surrounded by this man named Jesus. There's a lot of supernatural stuff that it's mind-boggling, especially when it comes when you're talking about miracles, and even after the his resurrection. I mean, honestly, he's with his disciples for 40 days after his resurrection, and I know this is in Acts 1, and they see a supernatural event that occurs. I hope you talk about that sometime in the future, because
Yes. The
that's
question, Fred,
yeah,
the question of miracles is extremely pertinent,
yeah.
because some of you are asking for the evidence of resurrection. The evidence for Jesus' miracles have multiple extra biblical sources. Roman writings agreed, Jewish writings agreed, and in fact, in modern times, even Islamic writings agreed that Jesus healed the sick. Jesus raised up people from the dead. This is in the Quran. So we have extra biblical evidence for miracles, but here is the actual pointer. There is more evidence for the resurrection than there is for any other miracle of Jesus. Think about it. And when I looked at that, I was just amazed. Why should this miracle have the maximum amount of evidence? And we will see that 2 weeks hence. I will show you some other scholars who have looked at this. This one is the best attested miracle of all the miracles of Jesus. This, the resurrection. Why? Because it is the most unbelievable. And that is why the most evidence had to be placed there so that people could believe. Belief by itself is blind, but faith requires evidence. So if you want to have faith in the fact of Jesus' resurrection, we must have evidence. And the greatest amount of evidence is for this miracle. Amazing. And we'll look at that when we meet again.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to close us out in prayer?
Let's pray. Our great God, throughout your history, you have done things that have clearly shown that you are the ultimate and true master of everything, including all that is in the universe. And therefore, to understand that, you gave us glimpses in the miracles that you performed, right from the old days in the Old Testament and right up to this. And thank you, God, you have given us evidence of Jesus' resurrection because he alone was resurrected from the dead. And because of that, he can turn to us and he has told us, he has promised us that because of that victory, we don't have to be afraid of death. So grant that we will really see this and get our faith so grounded, Father, that we will never leave your side, but we will always be with you, knowing full well that you have told us the truth, and the truth not just about our lives, but the truth about the great hope that you have given to us in Jesus, because he rose up from the dead. We also will live. That is your promise. We accept it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. We want to thank everyone for joining us tonight on Science, Philosophy, and Metaphysics.
Physics. Metaphysics.
Metaphysics Thursday. I know I'm a little rusty. So on that note, we will see you in 2 weeks when he will be back and he will have another presentation for you. Do you have one more thing to say?
No.
Nope.
I'm
Nope.
fine.
Okay. All right. God bless, and we will see everyone in 2 weeks.